Order, please. Daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a petition entitled Petition to Ban Hydraulic Fracturing in Nova Scotia. It's signed by 1,493 individuals, and I too have affixed my signature.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports, the Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Beg leave table a petition from constituents in my area, a long operative clause, so I'll read part of it. People who live on or must travel on Highway 202 between the intersection at the McCarthy Road and the Amber Light in Centre Rawdon and the Valley Road between West Gore and Rawdon Gold Mines are fed up with the conditions of these roads all year round. Mr. Speaker, there's approximately 300 signatures in this petition, and I've affixed my signature as well.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to present this resolution on behalf of the Minister of Emergency Management.
Oh, certainly.
I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this government wants Nova Scotian families in all parts of our province to be as safe as possible, and whereas May 1st to 7th is Emergency Preparedness Week in Canada, a time set aside to highlight the increasing importance of being prepared for all emergencies, and whereas it is critical to their safety that Nova Scotians understand the risks we face, make a family emergency plan, and assemble a household emergency kit. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House encourage Nova Scotians to make sure that they are ready to take care of themselves and their loved ones for the first 72 hours of any emergency, as we recognize May 1st to 7th as Emergency Preparedness Week in Canada. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas April 28th was the National Day of Mourning to remember the 23 Nova Scotians who died at work or from work-related causes. And whereas Rick Clark, President of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour, was in Halifax to recognize those who have died and raise awareness of this very important issue. And whereas while driving to the Day of Mourning ceremony, Rick was in a car accident and suffered a broken ankle. Therefore, be it resolved that that the House of Assembly recognizes the important work Rick Clark does on behalf of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour and all Nova Scotians, wishing him a very speedy and thorough recovery. Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas hospice palliative workers, both paid and voluntary in Nova Scotia, provide unconditional, compassionate care and bring comfort and dignity to individuals approaching the end of their lives, and whereas during the week of May 1st to 7th, governments, healthcare workers, and volunteers recognize National Hospice Palliative Care Week by raising awareness about hospice palliative care, and whereas this year's theme is Communities Share the Care, How Can I Help?, which reflects that we can make a difference in the lives of those living with a life-limiting illness and those affected by it when we work together. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly recognize the week of May 1st to 7th as Hospice Palliative Care Week and acknowledge the dedication of healthcare professionals, staff, and volunteers in the field. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas I was pleased to take part in the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between the Canadian Space Agency and the Department of Education, the first in Canada, so that students can learn more about space exploration, technology, and careers. And whereas Mr. Brian Ellenberger, principal of Southdale North Woodside School, has been a provincial leader with the Science Lead team for grades primary to 6 for more than 7 years and has been an inspiration for hands-on, minds-on science involving critical thinking, literacy, and mathematics. And whereas students and staff of Southdale North Woodside School graciously hosted astronaut Dr. Robert Thirsk at the signing event and had the opportunity to ask questions. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly thank Southdale North Woodside School Principal Ellenberger for all his great work engaging students and teachers in science, technology, and the exciting field of space exploration. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas May 2nd is Federal Election Day, and whereas candidates and volunteer organizers of all political stripes have been working hard over the last 6 weeks in communities across the country, and whereas tonight Nova Scotians and Canadians will come together and watch democracy unfold in all provinces from east to west. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly congratulate the many candidates, staffers, and community volunteers who have worked during the election campaign, and encourage all Nova Scotians to get out and exercise their right to vote. Mr. Speaker, and I would request waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas an estimated 36% of Nova Scotians gave care to someone because of a long-term condition, mental illness, or temporary difficult time, and whereas those women and men give freely of their time, energy, and income to provide the love someone needs, and whereas May is Family Caregiver Month, a time to recognize the dedication, energy, and love family caregivers provide, therefore be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly join me in celebrating the month of May as Family Caregiver Month in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 371 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Highways Act.
The Honourable Minister for Transportation Infrastructure Renewal begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 371 of the Revised Statute 1989, the Public Highways Act.
Bill number 51, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 371 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Public Highways Act.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the NDP government has slashed public education funding in Nova Scotia, and whereas the future of Nova Scotia's economy depends on providing the best education possible for our young people, and whereas this short-sighted and ill-advised decision by the Dexter government has put the future of Nova Scotia in jeopardy, therefore be it resolved, members of the House of Assembly urge the NDP government to reconsider their deep cuts to public education in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Bedeck Volunteer Fire Department Ladies Auxiliary has been a constant source of support for the department's firefighters for more than 40 years, and whereas in times of fire or emergency, the Ladies Auxiliary has been called upon to provide food, drinks, and a warm word of encouragement, as well as to volunteer at fundraisers and department functions, and whereas over the years, the dedicated members of the Bedeck Volunteer Fire Department Ladies Auxiliary have raised more than $175,000 for the department, therefore be it resolved that all members of this Legislative Assembly commend the Bedeck Volunteer Fire Department Ladies Auxiliary for their dedication and tireless commitment to the fire department and to their community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Jenny Armin Parida of Pictou took part in a Young Writers Workshop sponsored by the Pictou Antigonish Regional Library and their Writers in Residence program. And whereas Ms. Armin Perita was a part of a group of 4 young writers from Pictou County who participated in a writing workshop under the guidance of writer in residence Gary Blackwood to write an original one-act play called While It Lasts. And whereas the play While It Lasts was entered and performed at Theatre Annikenish's One-Act Play Festival in March and won the award for Best New Play at the festival, therefore it be resolved that all members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulate Jenny Armin Perita for being part of a group of young writers who wrote an award-winning play at the Theatre Annikenish Festival and wish her success in future writing projects, and furthermore to thank the Pictou Annikenish Regional Library for its Writer in Residence program. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I should move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia has the highest rate per capita of sexual assault in our country, and 9 out of 10 sexual assaults go unreported. Whereas Nova Scotia has the lowest rate of laying charges in sexual assault cases. And whereas the Avalon Sexual Assault Centre of Halifax teaches skills for intervention, aid for the abused, and encouragement to break the silence on sexual assault. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House acknowledge May as Sexual Assault Awareness Month and recognize the need for action on this important issue. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas citizen participation in the political process through the act of voting is the cornerstone of our democracy and that ensures an accountable and responsible government. And whereas voting is the easiest and most important form of civic duty that gives citizens a stake in the future of their community and their country. And whereas to be free to speak without fear, free to worship in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, or free to choose those who shall govern my country is what former Prime Minister John G. Diefenbaker called the heritage of freedom. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize how fortunate Canadians are to enjoy the right to vote freely and urge all Nova Scotians to exercise their democratic right today during Canada's 41st election. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on June 3rd, the annual Pictou County Relay for Life will be held at the Scott Weeks Parkdale Park in Glasgow. And whereas the event will host approximately 70 teams who will be walking all night to raise funds to fight cancer, remember loved ones, and support those who are fighting. And whereas the last year's Pictou County Relay raised over $250,000 with over 72 teams participating, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the residents of Pictou County for their amazing commitment to the Relay of Life and thank the participants for their fundraising success for such a worthy cause. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas multiple sclerosis is a devastating, unpredictable disease which affects balance, hearing, memory, mobility, and vision, with the effects of the disease being physical, emotional, and financial. And whereas May is Multiple Sclerosis Awareness Month in Canada. And whereas because women are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with MS than men, Mother's Day weekend serves as the focal point for the MS Carnation fundraising campaign. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House acknowledge May as MS Awareness Month and extend our appreciation to the volunteers who will raise funds for the MS Carnation campaign this coming weekend. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Cape Breton's North Side has a rich and interesting sports history that will be welcomed into a new home at the Northside Civic Centre in October this year, and whereas plans for Northside Sports Hall of Fame began in April 2009, and a committee, including Bob Gordon and Sarah Laker, has been working ever since to honour the area's many sporting greats, and whereas April 16th was this year's deadline for applications to the Northside Sports Hall of Fame. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly applaud the dynamic efforts of the Board of Directors of the Northside Sports Hall of Fame Association and wish them every success with plans for the 2011 induction ceremonies. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I read this on behalf of the member from Queens. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Warren Wagner of Brooklyn, Queens County has contributed to the business community of Queens County for 28 years, and whereas through the activity and growth of his business, Memory Lane in Liverpool, Queens County, Warren Wagner has been a leader in providing imaging and digital technology to the area, and whereas Warren Wagner, after 28 years in business, has retired. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia House of Assembly recognize and congratulate Warren Wagner on his retirement and thank him for his contribution to the business community of Queens County. Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I should move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Chalice is a Canadian Catholic sponsorship and development organization working to alleviate the effects of poverty in the developing world, and whereas Chalice was founded 15 years ago in Nova Scotia and works to alleviate poverty in 15 countries, including Haiti and Ukraine and countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and whereas Chalice was named the #1 international aid and development charity in Canada in 2010 for being a good steward of the donations it employs. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House congratulate founder Father Pat Cosgrove and the Lower Sackville-based Chalice on their week-long celebration of the Chalice family on May 1st to May 8th, 2011, and thank them for their service to the international community and to enriching the lives of their recipients, donors, and volunteers. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Coal Miners Cafe hosted a John Prine tribute to benefit the local food bank in January 2011. And whereas Anne and George Stupakis of Inverness returned from Boston to open the Coal Miners Cafe with its warm interior design celebrating the history and significance of coal mining in Inverness. And whereas the John Prine tribute welcomed local musicians to play the classic music of one of North America's finest songwriters before a standing room only gathering. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize the cultural and economic contributions of Anne and George Stupakis in their dedication to entertaining the people of Inverness and those who visit this special place. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mr. Bill Alexander has been a long-time resident of Stanley Section, Lunenburg County, and an important member of his community, and whereas Mr. Alexander has volunteered his time to the local seniors club in the New Germany area, the Lions Club, the local medical center, the Canada Day Committee, and many other volunteer projects, big and small, and whereas on February 18th at the Masonic Lodge in New Germany, Mr. Bill Alexander was recognized for his volunteer work by being named the Maritimer of the Week by CTV Atlantic. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Mr. Bill Alexander for being named Maritimer of the Week, acknowledge his significant contribution to his community through his volunteer work, and wish him health, success, and happiness in the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Where Sheila Evans of Lawrencetown, Nova Scotia, as a life member in the Royal Canadian Legion, where she has been very active for the past 37 years, and became interested in the veterans at a very young age. And whereas Sheila has recently received the Royal Canadian Legion Meritorious Service Award, which is the highest award that can be granted to a life ordinary associate or affiliate voting members, and very few members within the Royal Canadian Legion receive this award in their lifetime. Whereas Sheila is a respected member of the Centennial Legion Branch 160 and is dedicated to all of her honors for all the volunteer work and her many accomplishments over the years. Therefore, be resolved, members of this House of Assembly recognize the invaluable contributions and services rendered in her dedication to our veterans, and join me and congratulate her on this very prestigious award. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Lunenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas two Parkview education students, 15-year-old Cole Skinner and Rebecca Weigel, were selected as alternatives for the respective Canada Games hockey teams, and whereas Cole Skinner of Spectacle Lake is technically sound goalie who plays in the South Shore Mustangs and earned himself the role of alternate goalie in the Winter Games, and whereas Rebecca Weigel of Masons Beach has contributed excuse me, as a first-year player in the midget AAA team Metro Boston Pizza, and is mentoring other goalies in her community, also chosen for the alternative goalie during the Canada Winter Games. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognizes the achievement in sport of these two young goalies, Cole Skinner and Rebecca Weigel, and congratulate them for their participation in the Canada Winter Games. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas justice is a significant issue in Nova Scotia, a concern made greater with the 7 murders in the province already this year. Whereas since March there have been 16 shootings in Halifax Regional Municipality alone, and whereas the NDP government cut crime prevention programs by 55% in this year's budget. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly condemn the NDP government's cut to crime prevention programs and demand a renewed focus on the prevention of crime in Nova Scotia.
Hear, hear. The Honourable, there has been a request for waiver. I hereby, the motion is tabled. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia's fire brigades are made up of individuals who are dedicated to serving others, and whereas these firefighters not only contribute hard work, skills, and time, they often risk their lives and must deal with incidents of great emotional stress. And whereas firefighters seldom receive the accolades which they deserve, most fire brigades hold a banquet each year to thank all of their members and to present special honours. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of the House of Assembly congratulate Ken McLean of the North River and District Fire Brigade, Colchester North, for receiving a 30-year service award. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas for 16 years the Halifax Comedy Festival has been a successful and highly anticipated cultural event in Atlantic Canada, and whereas performances were staged across Halifax during the Halifax Comedy Festival from April 13th to 16th, 2011, and whereas Paul LeBlanc was the volunteer chair for the Atlantic Comedy Festival Society. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly recognize the work of Paul LeBlanc and all members of the Atlantic Comedy Festival Society in promoting the arts and cultural community of Nova Scotia, and congratulate everyone involved with the Society on another successful and hilarious season of comedy. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this evening, award-winning country music artist George Canyon will host the George Canyon and Friends Diabetes Heroes Tour at Fountain Hall. And whereas this extraordinary event will be filled with great entertainment and inspirational stories of individuals who have triumphed while living with diabetes. Whereas Jordan DePap, Lindsay Carswell, and Mike Fisher will all of whom have type 1 diabetes, will share their insights and prove to everyone that being diabetic doesn't mean you can't pursue your dreams and live life to the fullest. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House extend our appreciation to George Canyon for his unwavering commitment to advocate for persons with type 1 diabetes, and wish the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation all the best for a successful event. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Eastern Shore District High School Glee Club performed their first annual Limelight Dance Competition, and whereas the 16 students of the Eastern Shore District High Glee Club work long hours and early mornings with the professional teaching staff of the school, perfecting their singing and their dance choreography. Whereas the Eastern Shore District High School Glee Club, under direction of both Ms. Alan Penwell, Director of Music, and Ms. Heather Allen, Director of Dance, achieved a gold standard and top mark in the novice song and dance category, and were awarded the Broadway Bound Spirit Award. Therefore, be resolved, the members of this House of Assembly congratulate the Director of Music, Ms. Alan Penwell, and Director of Dance, Ms. Heather Allen, and all the hardworking and talented students of the Eastern Shore District High Glee Club on their significant achievement in this competition, and wish them luck in all their future endeavours. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. There has been a request to revert back on the order paper, so I'd ask all those in favour to say aye. Aye. Those against say nay. Motion is carried. I will now recognize the honourable member for Richmond on presenting and reading petitions.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Au nom de mon collègue, l'honorable député de Clare, je désire présenter une pétition qui dit « Attendu que la moyenne des frais de scolarité et les frais afférents pour les études de premier cycle en Nouvelle-Écosse ont presque doublé depuis 1990, attendu que les frais de scolarité de la Nouvelle-Écosse, qui s'élèvent à près de 5500 $, sont parmi les plus élevés au Canada, attendu que les étudiantes et étudiants étrangers payent au moins le double pour la même éducation et que les étudiantes et étudiants inscrits au domaine d'études professionnelles font face à des frais de scolarité annuels de près de 14 000 $, attendu que les étudiantes et étudiants de premier cycle en Nouvelle-Écosse traînent une dette étudiante moyenne de 30 000 $, soit le niveau le plus élevé au pays, attendu que les frais de scolarité réduisent les possibilités d'éducation de nombreuses familles dont les revenus est faible ou moyen, tout en anticipant les obstacles pour les étudiantes et étudiants autochtones des régions rurales, racialisées et autrement marginalisées. Attendu que la Nouvelle-Écosse fait face à une diminution des inscriptions et qu'elle compte parmi les deux seules provinces à pénaliser les étudiantes et étudiants aux provinces en imposant des frais de scolarité plus élevés, attendu que 82% des nouveaux emplois requièrent des études postsecondaires, attendu que les 11 universités de la Nouvelle-Écosse soient une industrie d'1 milliard de $ fournissant 30 000 emplois directs et indirects, et attendu que le gouvernement provincial dépense 2 000 de moins par étudiante ou étudiant pour la moyenne nationale. Nous, sous-signés et sous-signés, faisons pétition pour que l'Assemblée législative de la Nouvelle-Écosse réduise immédiatement les frais de scolarité et les frais afférents pour toutes les étudiants et étudiantes, fournissent 50% de tous les prêts d'études provinciaux en tant que bourse et augmente le financement par étudiants.
Order, please. Can I just have the operative clause read, please?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'm almost done, Mr. Speaker. Augmente le financement par étudiante ou étudiant à la moyenne nationale. Monsieur le Président, cette pétition est signée par 190 étudiantes de l'Université Saint-Anne et j'ai signé la pétition moi-même. Mr. Speaker, this petition is from the students of Université Saint-Anne, which are calling upon government to address the issue of post-secondary tuition fees in Nova Scotia, with the petition clause being, we, the undersigned, petition the Legislative Assembly of Nova Scotia to immediately reduce tuition and ancillary fees for all students, provide 50% of every provincial student loan as a grant, and increase per student funding to the national average. This petition is signed by 190 students of Université Saint-Anne, and I have affixed my signature, and I'm presenting the petition on behalf of my colleague, the Honourable Member for Clare.
Petition is tabled. There also has been a request to revert back in the order paper to presenting reports of committees. Is it agreed? Against? The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As chair of the Committee on Law Amendments, I am directed to report that the committee has met and considered the following. Bill number 1, an act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989 in the Motor Vehicle Act. Bill number 7, an act respecting the administration of justice. Bill number 13, an act respecting the profession of pharmacy. Bill number 19, an act to amend Chapter 30 of the Act of 2000, the Nova Scotia Business Incorporated Act. The committee recommends the bills to the favourable consideration of the House without amendments.
Order these bills be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Bills. The Honourable Minister, revert back to tabling reports of committees. Statements by ministers. Presenting reports of committees, the Honourable Minister of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism.
Tabling reports. Mr. Speaker, during estimates, I was asked for a number of things pertaining to the budget, and what I'd like to table is the Antigonish Eastern Shore Tourism Association. It's the partnership agreement funding and special projects, and I would also like to table, Mr. Speaker, the partnership agreement. The Nova Scotia Department of Tourism, Culture and Heritage, as represented by the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage, and the Antigonish Eastern Shore Tourism Association, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Orders of the day. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Could you please call Bill 27, the Financial Measures 2011 Act?
Bill number 27, the Financial Measures Act. The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the opportunity to continue my remarks on this piece of legislation. I know we had a very spirited evening the last night I spoke, and it should be spirited tonight. It's an election day today. But let's start with something positive about some of the measures that are in this piece of legislation. And one of them is, and these are items that are reasonable. You know, there's a measure in about tobacco to using stamps to protect against contraband, and it's a federal initiative that's trying to be accomplished. So, Mr. Speaker, that's something that is favorable, and that would be a positive development. We know that there is a lot of contraband in our province right now. We're trying to reduce the number of people who smoke and use tobacco because it has significant health effects, as we all know. And I know there were measures taken a number of years ago by the Office of Health Promotion because tobacco reduction was one of the 6 priorities of that office. And I know that there had been success in reducing the amount of people smoking and getting contraband off our streets, off our highways, wherever it's being transported is something that we should be focused on, because if we can better control tobacco, hopefully we can better control whose hands it's getting into. And I think particularly for anybody, Mr. Speaker, but certainly for youth who maybe, if they're getting their start with illegal tobacco, and they, of course, we know how addictive tobacco is. There was also a measure in there about bus inspectors. They're basically being moved from the UARB to the Department of Transportation. There's nothing of significance that we have seen there to object to that. There's nothing to do with the film tax credit that would be negative. We see it as a positive. They're changing the cap for amounts eligible for labor costs, making that cap higher, and that's, as I understand, to assist, better assist the sector in the film business of digital animation, because it's very labor intensive. So, Mr. Speaker, those are some positive things, but I had a chance to, it's a very short list, yes. I had a chance to visit the shopping center in Port Hawkesbury over the weekend, and you get a feel for what's on people's minds. And I popped into one of the stores, and they told me that the increase in the HST has been hurting their business. They've been quite quiet, and they see people polarized. They seem to be going to either end of the mall, to the big box stores. And the people working there felt that the increase in the HST was making people even more price sensitive. And people were shopping for the best bargains they could get. And so I think it's, and I told them that I would carry that message to the legislature, because they're working hard, they're trying to ply their trade in the shopping mall, and but the consumer is hurting, and the consumer is not coming into the store as much as they once did. Another interesting thing I noticed, and I don't think this would be strange to anybody sitting in the legislature here, but a lot of people, and I'm not directing this to this government in particular, but I think all governments are seen nowadays as perhaps not listening to people. Whether that's true or not, I guess that's up, at the end of the day, that's up to the electorate. But people don't feel like government is listening to them. One comment that caught my attention was people were saying, a couple people had said that it's all on television. They're not, they don't feel connected to their politicians. And sometimes they give up. They may have approached a politician in the past about something. An issue might have come up in government, whatever level, wouldn't matter, but sometimes people lose faith. And I think it's important for us, all, no matter what party we belong to, especially on a day like today when there's an election, to remember the importance of listening, not just leading up to the election, but well after the election too. And so, Mr. Speaker, and one of the items that is in this piece of legislation is the increase in user fees. And one of the things that we talked about, or I spoke about the last time I stood here in the legislature, was the importance of us showing people the transparency behind user fees. And I think all parties in this legislature have called for it at one time or another. And I know there were a lot of people who feel the same way. Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left in my remarks? I know that
18 minutes.
18 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, you know, this is one example in this piece of legislation that I think Nova Scotians spoke about, because we've heard about it, because every party in this legislature agreed with them at one time or another that there should be transparency behind user fees. And the importance in the transparency is mainly because people deserve to know what they're paying for and why it costs as much as it does. And I gave the comparison to government being different from the private sector, in that when you buy something at a store, go out anywhere, walk out onto the street, buy something in a store here, Mr. Speaker, there's a competitive process that brings that product or that service to market, and people know that they're getting something. They're hopefully getting the best value for their dollar. We should be striving for the same thing in government. So that's something that we see in this piece of legislation, giving the government the ability to increase user fees by 2% this year, but there's no measure in there to ask or call upon government to be transparent. and explain to Nova Scotians why there's an increase in the user fees. We can say inflation, sure, but that's only one component of the cost, Mr. Speaker. Another measure that was in this that's in this piece of legislation is the MOU, and that's something else that I know a lot of Nova Scotians are going to be hearing about from the municipal councillors, and those councillors are going to explain to Nova Scotians how the government changed the terms of the agreement that is now going to cause pressure to be put on municipalities. And that pressure is going to come because the province is not going to be providing the same funds as it had promised for court services and for housing costs to help municipalities with those issues. So that's revenue that the municipalities were expecting, but they're not going to get. And Mr. Speaker, I don't know if there's any councillors listening tonight, but I'm sure that they're going to be explaining to their constituents about this. And so it gets back to the theme of listening, Mr. Speaker. And you know, I guess if the government chooses to change its mind on something, that's a case where people don't feel like they're listened to, or they feel that it doesn't matter. And that gets back to the comments of a couple of people I spoke with on the weekend when they felt that, you know, should I bother going to vote? And I know we all read resolutions today encouraging people to vote because of the importance of democracy. But what do you say to somebody who's lost faith? I know I said to them, well, if there's something I can do, give me a shot at it anyway. I'll give it a try. But there is, and you know, people voted NDP in the last election, and they were looking for change. But as it was established the last time I spoke, Mr. Speaker, they didn't get change. And I can tell from the people that come to visit me in the office in Inverness. And I might, Mr. Speaker, look around me after the next election and be surrounded with a lot more colleagues. And I guess, Mr. Speaker, the answer in that will come in the next election, and maybe the answer will come from the people who vote, who feel like they're being listened to. So I was out on the weekend listening, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I'm bringing some of these points forward here today. Another thing that people had said, and I know everybody here will relate to this, is the price of gas. And there's not a lot we can do to control the price of oil. It's traded out on the open markets, and all the strife in the Middle East, in North Africa, and there's a fear that it could move into the real oil-rich nations. That's what's driving the price of oil up. And Mr. Speaker, you know, the price of oil, as it goes up, the price at the pump goes up for gasoline. And for a lot of people that I spoke with on the weekend who are working, for them, if they're not, they may not be making the big salaries of, say, what a doctor might make or some other person might make in this province. For them, when the price of gasoline goes up, it affects them significantly. And they start looking at their budget, their weekly budget. And when they're driving, you know, some people, I spoke to one person, they work in Port Hawkesbury, and Port Hawkesbury is a real hub area. There's people who drive in 40, 50 minutes away from Port Hawkesbury. And significant drive. They're doing that 5 days a week, Mr. Speaker. That's 200 minutes in the car. And I'm not going to do the math on how many kilometers that is right off the top of my head, but it's a significant amount of time spent in their vehicle, and they're spending a lot of money on gas. So, you know, I raise this because it's all the more reason, Mr. Speaker, why it's important for government to be making sure that we're giving Nova Scotians more affordable government. And when we look at the increase in the user fees of 2%, well, that's another added cost. We're not helping them there. When we change our agreement with the municipalities to reduce their revenues and put pressures on them to increase their taxation, we're not making government more affordable for Nova Scotians there. And when the government raised the HST, Mr. Speaker, after they promised they wouldn't, again, we're not making government more affordable for Nova Scotians there. So, Mr. Speaker, these are the reasons why we find it difficult when we look at this legislation to be happy about it. We would prefer if government was taking some of the, maybe taking a page out of our books. We've introduced some legislation, Mr. Speaker. And for instance, the Balanced Budget Act that we felt was very sensible. And we would restore the requirement for government to table balanced budgets and limit government spending, limit it to population plus inflation, the cost of inflation in a given year. Mr. Speaker, this would take the pressure off taxing the people more. So when those people are driving to work, you know, they may be paying more for gas. It's hard for us to control that, but maybe we can give them a saving somewhere else. Maybe we can save them a little bit on the tax side when they go to buy their fuel at the gas pump. So that's something that we've put forward. We'd love to see it in this piece of legislation, but it's not there. We also said that when the provincial budget is balanced, would reduce the HST to 13%. Another sensible measure, Mr. Speaker. Another way to show Nova Scotians that we're listening, that we care when they say that they're facing pressures in their family budgets each week, and that we're trying to do something that we can control to make life more affordable for them by giving them more affordable government. And how do we do that? We'll look at the user fees again. If government doesn't even know how much it costs to deliver these services, or only knows in a very rough sense, Mr. Speaker, how can we expect to control those costs? If you opened up a small business in Nova Scotia tomorrow and you didn't understand what your costs were, how would you know how much to charge for your product or your service? And if you didn't control those costs, you might find that a competitor might be selling their product or service for cheaper than you are, and you'd be out of business. So, Mr. Speaker, this legislation that we're being asked to support here, we have difficulty with it because the whole principles that we should be looking at right now are determining what costs there are in government, trying to control them, and giving people a break on their taxes. And that's really what creates the environment for a good economy. It takes resolve, Mr. Speaker. It takes difficult decisions. But you know, sometimes, and I think we think that we can't make changes in government, we need to change in government, Mr. Speaker. We always need to change. And it doesn't matter if you're in government or if you're in any organization, change is healthy. And, you know, I would like to start seeing change towards balanced budgets. I would like to start seeing change towards more affordable government for Nova Scotians and change towards lower taxes. Another piece of legislation that we were putting forward was the Value for Money Act. We don't see anything in the legislation here about it, but this would be, basically the idea was to try to establish some goals for program performance and measure the results. And if we can find ways to deliver a service more efficiently or better for Nova Scotians, we think that makes sense, Mr. Speaker. And so lastly, I'm not going to use all my time this evening, but we did introduce another measure. And in fairness, I think it needs to be pointed out because there would be some cost to government. And that was a tax credit to farmers who make donations to food banks. And based on our numbers, the costs are not significant. We think it's an interesting piece of legislation that deserves a look, and I know that our Liberal colleagues have also introduced a piece of legislation similar. I took a look at the numbers, Mr. Speaker, and I wanted to make sure that they were meaningful, because if there was no uptake by farmers, then there wouldn't be much sense in putting it forward. And we did speak with a lot of sectors in the agricultural industry, and they felt the numbers that we were putting forward would be reasonable and there would be uptake. So, Mr. Speaker, we would encourage the members of this legislature to take a look at that piece of legislation. And if they have any questions about it, if it's something that they would like to see passed, at the end of the day, the goal of the legislation is to help people. It's to help feed people that are going to our food banks. And it's about helping farmers if we've seen it throughout history. Mr. Speaker, there are people starving in the world, and we have farmers in countries where there is surplus agricultural product being destroyed. We even saw it during the Depression, when people were devastated by the economy, the effects of the Depression, and some people, I suppose some people were starving, Mr. Speaker, and yet farmers, in their frustration because the price for their products was so low, they were destroying them to protest to the government because they were suffering as well. They were working hard to produce goods, and they weren't getting fairly compensated for them. So, Mr. Speaker, the purpose of this food bank donation tax credit for farmers is, if there is some surplus corn or whatever it happens to be, I know I spoke with a couple of dairy farmers, they might find a way to maybe able to make that happen. If we can get more food product to the food banks in a cheap way that helps to offset the costs for farmers, they might be willing to do it. And I even spoke to one person in the agricultural community, and they said, you know what, we like the feel-good aspect of this legislation, because we would feel good about donating some food to the food bank. And Mr. Speaker, I should give credit to where this idea came from. It did not come from me. It came from somebody in Port Hawkesbury, a man who is chair of the food bank there. His name is Larry Evans. He's a lawyer. And he had taken notice of this. No doubt he's trying to find ways to improve the stock of food at the food bank in the Strait area. And, you know, he said, Alan, why don't you take a look at this? And I said, I thought it was a great idea. We ran it through our caucus. We did research on it with the agricultural sector, and we've tried to put forward something that we felt would not cost government a significant amount. We don't want to be handcuffing the government, but we feel that it's going to help farmers, and it's going to help people, less fortunate Nova Scotians who rely on food banks. So, Mr. Speaker, as I close our remarks, I would ask all members to have a look at that piece of legislation and consider giving a vote in favour of it, because I think if we do, at the end of the day, it would be nice for us to agree on a few matters over the course of a sitting. And there's one, I think, between the Liberals who've also proposed a similar measure. And I'm sure the compassion on the opposite side of the legislature will hold true, and hopefully we can get that bill passed as well. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude my remarks.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Getting up. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please stand and give a few remarks around the FMA Bill 27. First of all, I want to acknowledge the speaker prior to me, the member from Inverness, and his talk about the tax credit for farmers who donate food to the food bank. It is a great proposal. It's one that was brought to our caucus as well by, I think, the Federation of Agriculture had brought it to our caucus. I'm sure the government caucus would have received that. And I agree with him. That is a piece of legislation that I think all of us could agree on. Quite frankly, if the government does not want to pass an opposition bill, I would encourage a member from government to present that bill. It's one that we would support as a caucus. It is a good piece of legislation for Nova Scotians. It rewards the farmer for donating that produce. And of course, as the member previous spoke about, it provides those Nova Scotians who require our assistance in their time of need an opportunity to receive that healthy product from Nova Scotia. So if it's not our bill, I would encourage someone from the opposition or from the governing party to present a bill, one that our caucus would support without hesitation. Mr. Speaker, I've had a chance, as the previous speaker was in, and the finance critic from our caucus got up and talked about the FMA, and they've talked about a number of issues in here, and particularly the issue around what's not in it. They talked about bracket creep, which we all know was part of, it was introduced in 2005-06, that would come into effect in 2011 budget, that income tax brackets would be indexed. The present finance minister, when he was in opposition, was extremely critical of that, the practice of not indexing income tax brackets. He called it was a way for the government to reach into the pockets of Nova Scotians. I think he said pockets, wallets, and purses of Nova Scotians without actually having a tax increase. Mr. Speaker, we agree with him on this side of the House. It is fundamentally a way for government to raise revenue, and at the same time, Nova Scotians are losing their buying power. They're losing their ability to keep pace with expenses in their own homes. And Mr. Speaker, it's not just it is all across the financial spectrum, regardless of what income you're making. This as a way of, as the finance minister has said, it's a way of deep digging into the pockets of Nova Scotians, and quite frankly, without them even knowing it, they don't begin to feel that until they recognize that their buying power is disappearing. One of the other things that the present Premier and the Finance Minister talked an awful lot about, and that when they were on this side of the House, and it was the increase in user fees. I know that it's been talked about in this House. There's 1,400 user fees that have gone up, some of which would automatically go up in legislation. Others would have to have an order in council to go up. And it was important that we felt, and I think members in the government side felt when they were on this side of the House, that those fees should be debated in the House, that we should be here making sure that the increases are legitimate. As you know, Mr. Speaker, a cost of living increase, keeping pace with inflation, is okay, providing it is in a sense of covering what is the cost of delivering that service. So, and we should be able to debate that, and each minister should be able to get up and say the increases that have gone on in their departments in delivering that particular service and why it is important that the fee goes up to cover it. But within the absence of that, in the absence of that information, Nova Scotians are left to rely on what the Minister of Finance said when he was in opposition and what the Premier said when he was in opposition, that this is another form of a tax. This is nothing more than a tax increase by the government. I think we would be doing all of ourselves a service if we actually began to debate that in the House, or at the very least, when government presented those increases, they presented along with them a document that said, this is why this fee is going up. Here's the cost that's associated with it, and us to delivering that service to the people of this province. And this is a complete cost recovery. And that would allow Nova Scotians to look at it, and quite frankly, it would legitimize the process. It would make Nova Scotians feel that they were at least just paying for the cost of delivering that service as about a tax increase, Mr. Speaker. The other piece, and I know that's been debated here, is certainly the MOU with the municipalities and the downloading that has taken place, and it has brought municipal leaders across our province here. They've expressed to their constituents that they fully will expect property taxes to go up. I know that the minister responsible for this has spoken to the House following the memorandum of understanding and the clause that was in it that allowed government for extraordinary circumstances to back away from that clause, Mr. Speaker. But the memorandum of understanding, I know the minister and has spoken, and I've talked about this, it really is a question of fairness to municipalities. And when you begin to negotiate between levels of government, and you do negotiations and a memorandum of understanding our contract, it's very similar like we as a province does with the federal government. We negotiate a health social transfer agreement that, as a matter of fact, there will be a new one. I think the Minister of Health, I think in 2014, we'll have to do a new round around a negotiation on a delivery of a health agreement. Well, if every time a government changed in Ottawa or elsewhere had challenged that, they just automatically threw the old one out, it would make it extremely difficult for the province of Nova Scotia and other provinces to be able to deliver those services in a way that they budgeted for. Well, that's very similar to what's happening with the municipalities. They budgeted with the idea that we as a province would take over the funding of education, justice, Mr. Speaker, as well as social housing. And while yet that reduction hadn't happened in their budget, they began to make plans towards that. Mr. Speaker, and as municipalities, as part of that MOU, had taken over, I think it's the Property Service Evaluation Corporation that, and really what they taken over the assessment of properties, which used to be done by the province, and now we offloaded that to municipalities as part of this agreement. What we're actually changing is we're actually changing the part that applies to the province, but not throwing out the piece that applies to municipalities. For example, Mr. Speaker, I know in HRM here that municipalities have to have an auditor, and it's by legislation. And that's a cost associated, and it's actually in the memorandum of understanding that municipalities would deliver that. So if we're going to throw out part of this agreement, why should municipalities not, why couldn't we throw out the rest of it? Why wouldn't municipalities just say, okay, here, you have back the assessment piece of this. We don't want to deal with that anymore. We want to deal with the cost of that. That's not, I'm not encouraging municipalities to do that, but what I'm trying to say is that when governments, regardless of what political stripe, negotiate an agreement, it becomes the responsibility of future governments to live up to that, and when that agreement runs out, then you renegotiate. We can all be critical of previous governments, and we can be critical of this government for decisions that they've made going forward, but at the end of the day, we have to, if they get re-elected, they have to live with their decisions. If a new government comes in, they have to live with them. It's no different than what's going to happen in our country tonight. If the previous government gets re-elected, we go on. If a new government comes in, there's agreements that have been negotiated that the new government will have to live with. as tough as it may be for them in some of the difficult times, but they have to live within it because we as a province and other provinces and territories are budgeting and we're moving forward based on those agreements. And that's where the underlying piece that I think goes along with this, Mr. Speaker, is why it is so important that when governments of any stripe create a negotiation with whether it's municipalities or federal government, we need to respect that. And there's a certain level of respect that governments deliver regardless of what level it is you're dealing with. And that's the fundamental problem that I have with this agreement. We have backed away from part of it, but not all of it. And it's in my view that we shouldn't have backed away from any of it because, quite frankly, it is it's what municipal governments are dealing with to set their budgets going forward. And I would hope that whoever forms the federal government tonight, that they don't walk away from agreements that have been negotiated between them and provincial governments by the previous government, because I know how difficult it is to budget. I know how hard it will be for this government and governments in other provinces to budget if the federal government determines that they're going to walk away from a memorandum of understanding. So as we go forward, Mr. Speaker, I hope that we go forward in that spirit. I know during the last campaign there was a lot of talk about infrastructure dollars and who was going to keep. Were you going to keep the commitments of the previous government on infrastructure, all of which were important. It was money that was coming through from Ottawa, and we were willing to keep it. I believe that memorandum of understanding was also part of that conversation, and it is one that governments and provincial governments should have been able to keep and respect as we went forward. Mr. Speaker, the member from Dartmouth East is keeping me busy here. I'm getting a little nervous with him behind me. But nothing to be nervous about. Nothing to be nervous about. Listen, I know I didn't mean that in any bad way from a member from Dartmouth East. But he was actually being very supportive, and I want to thank him for that. He's been a great addition. He's been a great addition to our caucus, Mr. Speaker, and quite frankly, has a great understanding of how important the memorandum of understanding is for municipalities from the great work he has done as a municipal councillor prior coming into this house. So I do want to thank him for that and wish him all the success in future elections, as many as he wishes to run in. But also, Mr. Speaker, as part of this whole thing, and you know, I've been thinking about this, we've been debating this stuff. I've had an opportunity because of the federal election to campaign in a number of areas across our province. I was in Cape Breton. I was spent some time in Escasoni campaigning with our candidate there, and it was rather interesting to look. As I know, was brought up in the House. There's a new young chief in Escasoni who's doing great work, trying to address some of the challenges that are faced in the community, particularly around drug issues that are in the community, and education. And there were the two things that came up as he was making presentation. I was there for the Long Service Awards of members of the RCMP. That was actually on the reserve. It was a great celebration. It was great to be surrounded by a lot of red. Which was good to see them there. Red surge, of course, but it was interesting to talk to the young chief as he presented his presentation to the community, and it came back to how do we deal with the issue of drugs in our community. Some of it is prescription drugs, Mr. Speaker, and how do we deal with the issue of education and making sure that young people in our community are getting an opportunity to go forward. I want to acknowledge and congratulate the RCMP on the program where they're bringing First Nations members into the force because the chief had expressed, and as he was standing up there, he recognized a young member of his community who was probably about 2 years old, and he was dressed in they called it his Halloween costume because he was dressed in a policeman's uniform. It wasn't a red serge, but it was their shirt with the badges on it, and he said he wanted to be like his father, who had become a member of the RCMP. And I thought that is the way forward. That is how we began to recognize and begin to bring into communities. They see someone doing the job in front of them that they can do. For a generation before him, so many people told his father and his grandfather that profession was not for you, that you couldn't do that. Well, by that act, by the federal government, by the RCMP, by absorbing the Mi'kmaq police force in Cape Breton, they made it possible. And when I looked at that young person who was there and I saw the opportunities that were in front of him, I thought, you know what? We don't truly appreciate the impact that that gesture did for us as a province and as a country, decades out and generations out, by showing that young person that not only could his father become a member of the RCMP, but that profession is available to him. And it doesn't just apply to policing, Mr. Speaker. It can apply directly across all of our sectors. And when I had a chance to, as I was campaigning in other communities, on Friday I had a chance to go down into Bridgewater, and I campaigned in the town of Bridgewater, knocking on doors with our candidate down there, Mr. Speaker. And it was rather interesting, the stuff that was coming back to me. And it wasn't about political parties. There was, of course, the normal stuff you get on the doorstep of, you know, I saw they did this or they did that. But often what it was people were talking to me about their concerns that matter to them. And one of the things that came up and surprised me almost on every doorstep was the issue of education. And I ran into a grandmother who was looking after her 2 grandchildren and a foster child. And the first thing she said to me is, they're sleeping, so we have to be quiet. But she said to me, she was a retired pharmacist. So like all of us in this house, I started to talk about Bill 17. And, you know, that wasn't even on her mind in many ways. She's retired, but what was on her mind was education. And the education of not only her grandchildren, but of a future generation. She was looking at and hearing in the local papers about the closures of schools and schools being under review, and what impact that would have. And she's been also following the debate about reading recovery. Because all of us in this house know, and I'm sure have been exposed to the fact that the South Shore Board embraced that program like no other. Perhaps Shignecto might be able to say they did the same. But they actually embraced that program, understanding its strengths and its weaknesses. And what they did was they took its strengths of that program and used it as the foundation that it was going to build on a literacy program for the young people of the South Shore. And then they built a structure of other supports around it to help those children who may not fit exactly into that program. And her concern to me was, whatever you can do, fight for that program, because it is a foundation to giving my grandchildren and other children a way forward and hope for the future. And I found it interesting because, you know, and I know the member from Timberley Prospect, the Minister of Transportation, is here. When we sat on this other side of the house, I hope he doesn't mind me telling a little story. He talked about this place. We sometimes get caught up in what we do here. While it's extremely important, it is important, and I've said this many times, there is a way to realign yourself with the priorities, though, of the people of the province, and that is by getting out of this place on occasion and knocking on doors. And I know he has started, since being elected here, and I think it was 98, that a ritual of knocking on doors at least once a week in his, I was going to say Fridays, but didn't want to get on knocking on doors to realign himself with his constituents. And I think the fact that he gets sent back here with one of the largest majorities in the House, election after election, probably speaks to that. But that's what I was experiencing as I go, not just in my own riding, but as I go across the province. When I was in Yarmouth, it's a different scenario. What they're talking about is what are the economic opportunities that are going to be here because of the devastation of the link with the ferry service with New England going. They are real concerns. You know, you're a 45 or 50-year-old entrepreneur who's been working hard, having a business which has relied heavily on tourism, and all of a sudden, what you think is the mecca that's bringing the people to your business is gone. And you start to see the business erode underneath you, and you can't do anything to stop it. You try to remake yourself. I know some of them are coming to try to promote their product to residents of HRM, hoping they would go to Yarmouth for the weekend. But there's that fear of what happens, and then they start saying, well, we don't know what the plan is for us going down the road. Where is the plan to bring a ferry service back? If not, where's the plan to replace that economic driver with another one which will allow us to be here? And then in the same breath, you're talking to a young person in that community that's just automatically has given up any hope of ever living there. Their hope is moving, and they say, you know what, we've just listened to this. We see our parents, we see people around us who are trying to keep up, and there doesn't seem to be any hope. And as a matter of fact, year after year, it seems to fall behind. So they're saying our only option is to leave. Well, that's not the right option, Mr. Speaker. It's one of the reasons why I firmly believed in reducing the small business tax much more aggressively than we are. Because I believed it is putting the money in the hands of the men and women who have built our communities, quite frankly. They've suffered through recessions before, they've suffered through tough times, but they always weather them and they stay and stick with the community wherever possible. It's interesting when you get a chance to talk to a small business person in our communities, and I know all of us have had a chance to do that, and you get them to start talking about their employees. They're talking about their neighbor more often than not, and they seldom talk about, they'll tell you what a valuable person this person is to their operation, but more they'll then quickly go back to the human side of all of this, which is, you know what, not only is he a great employee or she a great employee, but they've coached my child in hockey or soccer, or you know what, I've seen them, they're on the SAC, or they sit on the Health Foundation. You know, that person, you should see the work they've done with nonprofit organizations in our community in their spare time. And they begin to tell you the story of how our communities are alive and thriving. And they are the people, at the end of the day, when they start looking at their bottom line and see challenges, the very last thing they're going to do, Mr. Speaker, is look across that table and lay that person off unless they have no option. It isn't about increasing their profits. It isn't about anything else. It is about investing in that person who's stuck with them. And oftentimes they weather that storm, and they're there to prepare themselves for the upswing that will happen. Every time there's a downturn in the economy, it is followed by an upswing. And the ones who survive are the ones who've been able to remake themselves, but more importantly, who weathered it and set themselves up to take advantage of the opportunities that exist at the end of the day. And that's why I think as a province and as a provincial government, those are the people we need to be investing in. I've been extremely critical of the Industrial Expansion Fund. I've been critical of it for a couple of reasons, but one, I don't think it's open and transparent enough. I think Nova Scotians should have a chance to see the investments they're making. But I also, it has been a tool that has been the only tool that governments have used, and it really doesn't reach out to the vast majority of the small businesses in this province who are driving the economy of every one of our constituencies. They're 3 or 4 or 5 person operation who are really what's driving the community and what's driving our local economy, and what's also, and the people who are surrounded them are the people who are driving the social fabric, if you will, of our own individual communities. And when they start to collapse, it's not just the economy that collapses, it's the social economy that collapses too, because people start to disappear. They see no hope. You know, we all, those who have children, want them to be near. We want them to, you know, whether it's somewhere in Nova Scotia, preferably nearby, that you can send your grandchildren back home before you don't have to keep them overnight. That's what I'm hearing anyway. Yeah, but I don't know if many of you know, but the member from Colchester North became a grandmother again on Friday. So the second girl in the Casey family, the first one was spoiled, and I'm sure the next one will be just as spoiled as the first one. But Mr. Speaker, she had I agree with you 100%. She is a leader, Mr. Speaker. But when you look at what's happening, when I hear and you get out and talk to people, it's not just an economic issue that we're fighting with. It is the individual economy or the social fabric of our communities, which is disappearing. And until we turn around and reinvest in the individuals who have been, I'll go back to it again, who have stuck with us through the very difficult times, I think we're going to go through this cycle. And in some cases, it's going to be extremely difficult to bring our communities back. I had an opportunity as I was leaving Bridgewater to head home to my riding of Annapolis. I took the number 10 as I spoke to the Minister of Transportation, and I told the Minister in estimates about the number 10. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, it is an economic corridor between the Valley and South Shore, and it is absolutely atrocious. You know, when you go across that road, it is little wonder that, I mean, there are signs up all over the place. They've been promised multiple times to have the road done. I want to, and I've acknowledged to the Minister of Transportation how encouraged I know I was, and I think the road builders were, about the 5-year plan on paving. There's a section of that road that is part of that. I look forward to seeing that tender come out. But there's the worst section of that road is not part of that tender, and what we'll be looking for, and I know in the conversation I had with the Minister as they revamp that plan year after year, that the other pieces begin to become part of the plan, paving plan going forward. It is one of those things in a way, and I've talked to the Minister about this in estimates, it is one of those things that instills confidence back in communities. That for too long, and it goes through all political stripes and not just in this province, where you would pave a certain section of a road and then you'd leave it for 10 years and you'd be paving all over the place. When in actual fact, I can tell you, because the section number 10 was paved in 2002, just prior to my election. It was about 10 months before my election in 2003. They paved that section, and they paved the section right directly in front of my house, about an 8-kilometer strip before I was elected in 2003. And last year, there was another 4 kilometers on this 30-kilometer stretch of highway that was paved. And I said to the Minister, and I've said to previous ministers, if we want to build confidence in the communities in the province, and the taxpayers that we know what we're doing, then we need to say, here's our 5-year plan for this particular road that we're going to be working on. And they understand, quite frankly, if you can only do 4 kilometers. But if you only do 4 kilometers this year and then ignore them for 10, well, they just simply think you haven't understood a single thing that's said. If you do 4 this year because that's what we say we can afford, we do that. And then next year we do the remainder that we can afford. And it does a couple of things. It instills the confidence in communities that governments know what they're doing. It instills some confidence in that we're paving in a way that we're hitting the trunks, hitting the main arteries where commerce goes through. And it also, though, allows the men and women who work for the department in communities across this province to take some of the resources that they have in terms of RIM funding and other monies that they would have that are very precious, and it allows them to then use them in a more effective way, because they know, well, if that road's going to be done next year, there's no sense me putting a lot of RIM money in it or a lot of ditching, because that road will be done in the capital project. I'm going to take that money and divert it to a road or a community that has no hope of being paved over the next number of years, but with some investment would go a long way to keeping that road upkeep and cause some confidence within the community, and quite frankly would build some confidence in the department, that when I say the department, I don't mean here, I mean out in the field, that we've listened and allow them to manage their budgets in a way which is encouraging. Where the Minister and I disagree is on the paving plans. It's a difference in view, and I respect the position that he has taken. I disagree with that in the sense that I believe that we as a province should not be in the paving business. I believe it is the private sector that needs to make that happen. And I know that I live in a part of the province that, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, was one of the provinces that I think caused the department to go in this direction. Tenders were high. There were few people who were bidding on those tenders. I think that his direction that the minister and the government took last year in terms of the 5-year paving plan, in terms of putting out, and my hope was going to be that there would be a lot of tenders put out early, would eliminate some of that. What traditionally happens, Mr. Speaker, if you get a tender that comes out in February January, February, March, you get a fair bit of activity because people are hungry. When you start having tenders come out in July and August, what's happening is for the majority of people in this province, they start to put together their order book, and they want to make commitments to meet their obligations. So when they then have to turn very quickly to respond to a tender, whether it's in southwestern Nova Scotia or Inverness County where they may not have work, they just don't do it. So what we have then, we leave it to where there's a couple of large outfits that can respond. I think if we had done a better job of laying out what it is we're looking for in terms of work over the long haul, we could have dealt with that issue as opposed to investing in a paving plant. It is just a fundamental difference where I believe where the private sector can compete, where the private sector is doing it, they do it cheaper than we can, Mr. Speaker. And it is simply just my view on that. And I think it would have been wiser for us to have kept going down the road of making the changes that the minister had made and then make the changes in our terms of our tendering process. And you know what, if they come in, and I said this in my own community, if they come in with a quote that is too high, we say no to them. We're not going to accept that. We believe that's too high. We'll retender this. We'll put this back out. It's after all, it is taxpayers' monies, and we want to make sure that we're getting the best value for that. And that's why I believe if we had created and continued to allow the private sector to compete, we would be, the taxpayer would be at a better advantage. I happen to also in my community, my backyard, I had a company a few years ago open a quarry on property actually that my parents had owned. My property that my father had bought in 1967, 68, my parents had bought. And in the early 70s, I guess my father decided it was more important to feed us 17 kids or 13 kids that he was looking at than it was to have a couple hundred acres behind us. So he sold that property, and more recently someone bought it, and they put a quarry in. And it's a quarry that is operated, and 3 young families are doing tremendous work. It's the next generation of Spicer Construction has taken over that quarry. They're going to grow that business. They built a house in behind me. Actually, it's been a positive thing. But also as part of that, they have now a paving company coming up in New Brunswick called Northern that's coming into southwestern Nova Scotia that has made agreements to them to deal with some of those issues that we had been referred to around being competitive. That had been in the works for quite some time. And it is a way, to me, that piece has a way of evening itself out over the long haul without us as a taxpayer investing in paving equipment to go forward. Mr. Speaker, I had so as I went through, continued through that road, and I arrived home and I went campaigning the next morning. It's always nice to get out, and I always say I'm going to do it more regularly, like the Minister of Transportation does. But I've never quite been able to get that because I'm moving myself around the province. But it was interesting to get out. But the things that kept coming back to me it wasn't so much about. It wasn't so much the debate about who owns the paving equipment and things. It was people were talking about paving, and I made the reference about the Memorial Highway that I traveled on. They're referring, a couple of my constituents are referring to it as my Memorial Highway. And it's not because I'm in ill health. I think they're talking about my political health, not my personal health. But it's the issue. But the other thing that kept coming up and has come up is the issue of electricity and the cost of electricity. And we know the challenges that are out there in terms of this. I made a suggestion which I think is a positive one, and that there's a couple actually. One of freezing the DSM charges where they are presently, so that we could try to control that particular cost, which is in our domain. And the other one being is that we do a performance audit of Nova Scotia Power internally. That is not in any way to suggest, Mr. Speaker, that company is not running appropriately or anything. But I think it is important that when you're a monopoly and a regulated utility that we get an opportunity to see what's happening internally, that we do an audit, a performance audit, that we order the URB to do one, just like I'm sure every minister was ordered to do an internal audit of their own departments to find out, is there a way that, you know what, maybe in the good years we could be doing this, but you know what, times are tough right now and we're going to have to cut back. Well, I think it's a reasonable question for Nova Scotia to ask, has the power company done that? Has Nova Scotia Power looked internally to find those savings? Do they reflect the reality, you know, of what they're doing? Does it reflect the reality of the financial situation of our province? I would encourage the Premier to take that initiative, and because it really comes back to us as in government, and to ask the URB to order a performance audit internally of Nova Scotia Power. There are things happening beyond our control that are affecting the price of power. We all know that, just like there is the price of gas. But there are some steps that we can take internally to control some of those costs. And one of them is doing and having an honest performance assessment of Nova Scotia Power to ensure that whether the performance bonuses that are there are appropriate in this time, whether or not, you know, is the bureaucracy inside of that company bloated? Is it lean and mean? Or is it being used as an opportunity to just come back to us as the rate base to have an increase for their power? As well, Mr. Speaker, one of the other, and probably the issue that comes up to me more than any other issue is the issue of the price of gas. I'm sure all members of this House get that. I know when regardless of where it is in my riding, they start talking about the price of gas and what can you do about it. And when it comes right down to it, Mr. Speaker, as you know, as was mentioned by the previous speakers and mentioned in this House by me and others, that, you know, the price of oil is not set here. It's on a global market. There's 3 racks. We, as a province, our price of gas is set off the New York Exchange. Central Canada, I think, is down in Chicago, and in Western Canada, it's down on the West Coast to an exchange where they look at the price of oil and it sets. But what is different here, and what provincial governments do have control over, is the tax issue, on how much tax we charge and how we charge that. And I know when we were, Minister of Finance was in opposition, they talked about, and the Premier talked about the tax on the tax issue. In this province, it's 3.8 cents a litre that is an additional charge by just adding the HST on top of and charging it to the 25.5 cents of federal and provincial tax that we charge. So it adds an additional about 3.8 cents a litre. That's not huge, Mr. Speaker, in the minds of people. But what it is and what it does, it goes back to, I think, what I was speaking earlier about how we pave roads, about how we address issues in terms of, it sets a signal to people that you're listening and that you're hearing and that you're trying to respond with what you can. And I'll go back, I think the citizens of this province understand we're not going to fix, and we can't fix the global crisis that's going on in the Middle East that affects the price of oil. They understand all of that. But when they look at what we do charge on the tax side, they do see there's an opportunity for us to respond to that. And it sends a positive signal to them that we've at least heard them. It's like I mentioned earlier about the paving. If we can commit to a road and do it, it looks like we have a plan and we're responding to where they want to go. Mr. Speaker, and that is I think what they're looking for. You know, we as elected members sometimes get caught up in, like I said, into this building, but you know, my constituents are more worried about how they're going to meet their bills than they are worried about whether or not we're going to pass Bill 17 or the budget or anything else. What does it really mean to me at the end of the day, and how am I going to make ends meet, and how am I going to make sure that all my electricity is not, you know, what am I going to do, right? That's how do we help that, and what can we lay out to them? So I think it is important, Mr. Speaker, that we recognize that while we know there are challenges, a few simple signals to the voter, to the constituents, to the people of the province would go a long way. And they don't have to be massive. They don't have to be big changes. They don't have to be something earth-shattering. It just looks like we know what we're doing, I think would go and be an encouraging thing. One of the things that has come up, and you get into this, the federal political cycle, which is going on now, of course, in elections, and we went through one in 2009, and we are going through this the ad cycle that we're seeing today as a country, and the negative stuff that's coming out of some of those ads. It's quite worrisome, and I think we should be worried about that as a province on what direction our country's going in terms of how they run election campaigns and what direction we as a province want to go. And I think it speaks a tremendous amount to why there's a disillusionment from voters, why people are disengaged in the process. I can disagree with the government about its position to buy a paving plant, and I can lay out my position on that in a way that, and how I believe it affects the taxpayers, and they can lay out their position on why they believe it's best for the taxpayers to have one. And whichever one of us can convince enough people, we should make us government. Not about whether or not, I attended a certain place, or I visited some other place, or you didn't, or where were you weren't there, or all of those kinds of things don't seem to add up. And one of the things that's become very disappointing for me is that I don't believe the voters are actually believing any of us anymore. And that's a real problem. And how do we change that? How do we change that? How do we, other than each of us, day after day, going to our offices, responding to the constituents the best we can, and on an individual basis, I guess, responding to and being honest. When you can't, if I don't have the answer for you and I can't give you the answer and it's not going to happen, then you just say it's not going to happen. Can't do it. This is not fitting into the parameters that we, I'm sorry, but that's as opposed to thinking that we're going to just continually, and as political parties, making promises and commitments in campaigns. And what I find rather, and particularly, and I've noticed it in this, I noticed it not so much in provincially, but I have since, I've debated in this House, but I noticed it nationally, that nobody's actually believing anybody. It has become into where am I comfortable, in the sense of, who's going to do the least damage, who's telling me the least. I don't want to use the word in the House, Mr. Speaker, so I'm afraid you might not let me use it, but who's telling me whose story is less believable. There you go. Thank you. And and that's not where we should be as a political process. When we look at the disengagement of young people, I'm really curious to see how that happens in this federal election. On what has Rick Mercer been able to engage and mobilize young Canadians to get out and vote? I often get an opportunity, not as much as I'd like, to go into the high school classes of my own riding, and I often tell them they have so much power that they don't realize it. Collectively, they could vote me out of office, and that could probably happen to almost all of us if they all got together and decided they're going to vote and swing their votes in one way, on top of the support that a member who runs against me has. They could actually change the vote. They would determine who is there, and it makes it a healthy process. But I think I am someone, and I have been, about looking at, and particularly following the federal campaign, but living in our own campaign. I don't think it's good enough to say I didn't know anymore to people. I think people are saying, they try to figure, well, we knew. How come you guys didn't know? Don't tell us you can do that, because there's no way you can do that. Try to be, upfront and reasonable, and make those kinds of commitments. And I think I could be completely wrong, but I think that's what voters are looking for. And I think there's a willingness on the part of, whether it's the citizens of this province or this country, to tackle the tough issues that are in front of us, and there are a number of them. And it would give us an opportunity to lay out what is a forward-thinking debate on, I think, the couple of the largest challenges that are going to be facing us. How do we deal with the rising costs of healthcare? And how do we do that in a way that is effective and fair to the citizens of this province, making sure that we all have access in a timely manner? You know, and there is a sense in communities that they don't, you know, they all know we're not going to have every service available in every community. They recognize that. So how do we best deliver that model? What does it look like? And how do we distribute it equitably across the province? But we can't have that conversation because we're sometimes caught up in the minutiae of this stuff. And the other one is that I think is paramount in terms of economic opportunities for this province is to seriously have a look at our education system, to look at educational outcomes and the plan that we want for it for the next 5 to 10 years. And one that would live beyond, quite frankly, one mandate of a particular government, but it would go into a second mandate before they begin to go into, and there's a real, I think, an appetite. We know things are changing. I mean, as families, we're not replacing ourselves. There's less than 2 kids in families today. So we know that the demographics are changing. You know, we're getting, my own riding presently is looking at closure of 2 schools. But it doesn't mean they want to completely yank them out of the community. What they want to do is find a way, how do we reshape this building to make it more useful, quite frankly, beyond just education? How do we, you know, I often say Bridgetown understands it's not going to have a Y, but it should have a gymnasium that's open a lot more than 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And should be open to the community and could suffice more than just a gymnasium for students when they're in school. They are the primary user of that building, and they should be the primary user of that gym, but the community should be then the second. And how do we do that in a way that's effective, and how do we respond to that? One of the things that we're just opening in Bridgetown actually a new library, and I believe, and I've always been a believer, that in communities like mine, and ones where we're having an out-migration population, that those community facilities should be linked. I always believe the public library should be part of a public school. We shouldn't be investing in bricks and mortar. We should be investing in the infrastructure of that particular library, which would, whether it's electronic equipment, whether it is making sure the full resources are available. And during, you know, school hours, students are the primary users of that, and we expose them to top-notch electronics and stuff. But also at the same time, you have community members coming in. I've said in this house before, I had a chance to go to Guysborough, and I was in Chedabucto High School, and it was during the leadership contest of 4 years ago. It was the first time I'd been in it, and I went in. It was approximately 7 o'clock at night. When I arrived to have a meeting in one of the rooms. And I can tell you how surprised and impressed I was, not just with the building, but with the mix of the population that were using it. There were grandparents who were into the library that was there. There's young people in the gymnasium bouncing basketball around. There was community members in a meeting, all in this one facility. And I walked into the building at 7 o'clock at night, and it was alive. If I walked into a high school in probably any one of our other constituents, it would be it would almost be closed, unless there was a basketball game or something going on. When this was, and I think, we sometimes try to reinvent the wheel all the times, when I believe right inside of our province we have an example of a project. While it may not be perfect for every constituency, it certainly shows a way to deal with the out-migration challenges of some rural communities, and it allows us that we can expose ourselves to quality programming, a quality institution, one that is being used over the long run. And Mr. Speaker, and I think Nova Scotians are looking for, that's the kind of change they want, and that's, I think. And it's the kind of change I think that all of us at different times have talked about and have embraced, and it is one that I think we need to do and take on, Mr. Speaker. We have debating we just finished the debate and passed a budget. We're now doing the Financial Measures Act today, Mr. Speaker, but inside of that I don't see that kind of change that I just spoke about, and the change that I hear that I'm feeling when I'm out talking to Nova Scotians. As a matter of fact, it's prior to the campaign, I'm sure members of the governing party today would probably hear some of their voters said, well, you can't be any worse than the other guys. Now we're hearing we're no different than the other guys. And that's where, how do we best set an option to direction for our province? And I think that's, in a nutshell, is where I think what the voter is. And as I had a chance, like I said earlier, to knock on doors in a number of constituencies, people weren't talking to me about political parties. They were talking to me about the challenges they face on a daily basis, and how can we best respond to those as elected members, and recognizing, I think it's inherent to be a Nova Scotian that you're fair-minded, and they're fair-minded. The people who are out there doing are looking at us and they say, we know we can't expect the world to come to us, but we do expect you to feel like you've understood what we're saying, what we're that you're understanding at least how it feels to sit in our seat and sit at our table and deal with those very basic living issues of meeting the electricity, paying my power bill, dealing with gas. How do I, what about the economic opportunities in outlying areas? Well, yes, we recognize there's a depopulation of rural Nova Scotia. How do we deal with making sure, though, that those schools are still vibrant and we utilize them? All reasonable questions and asks, I think, and ones that I know we'll attempt to try to respond to, and I know when question period we'll be asking the government to respond to, particularly the electricity one and the gas one, and I'm sure we'll all come up with our solutions around how we deal with the out-migration challenges. But I had a chance, like I said, to go out in other communities, and it was a positive to sit down and talk to people, because oftentimes in this place we lose sight of what quite frankly really matters, and we get caught up as the advice I was given 7 years ago, that while the work we do in this place is important, you need to realign your compass every once in a while, and you do that by getting out and talking to people outside of this particular building. But, Mr. Speaker, with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I will take my place, and I look forward to getting a chance to see as the other members start talking about this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to all members for the opportunity to speak tonight. I know members are anxious to hear from others across the country besides me, but this is important that we continue to do the work of the House of Assembly even on a night like this. I think, Mr. Speaker, that budgets and the Financial Measures Act are a lot of numbers or a lot of clauses, but they do tell a story. And I think it's important that Nova Scotians hear the story of this particular budget and this particular act as we go through debate on the Financial Measures Act, and so that in some way we can make sense of the numbers, we can create a bit of a narrative in fairness, so that Nova Scotians will understand where we're headed as a province. And of course, in order to understand where you're headed, to tell the story properly, it's important that we begin by a quick recap of where we have been, using facts, using reality, in order to describe how we got to the position we're in today, and then use that to project where we're going in the future. This is what forecasts and budgets and FMAs are all about, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you from experience, when the province got put on the right track, at least the right track in terms of the method of accounting it uses, because that was in the year 2000, when the John Ham government, fulfilling an election promise, brought in the full range of generally acceptable accounting principles. Prior to that year, although we had a set of accounts, it was not fully compliant with generally accepted accounting principles. The governments of the day prior to then picked some and not others. They cherry-picked which accounting policies they would use. One need only remember the 1999 budget, the one that led to the defeat of the Liberal government, which they alleged was balanced, but it contained this entity called the Health Investment Fund, which was a $600 million borrowing, off-balance sheet borrowing. This is perhaps where Enron originally got the idea that this would be acceptable, because by any common sense measure, when you have a budget but you don't count the borrowing and expending of $600 million, clearly you're not following very good accounting principles. And it was that very act that tipped the scales against that government and that budget and led to the defeat of the Liberal government of the day and the election of a new government, including a promise to institute the entire range of generally accepted accounting principles. And I say this because you don't often see elections fought over the use of generally accepted accounting principles. It's not something that grabs the hearts of voters, but it was an issue in that election. And it led to the adoption of the entire set. Generally accepted accounting principles for the public sector, I might add, to be more specific. Subsequent to the adoption of those standards, of course, we ended up with an operating set of accounts and a separate capital set of accounts. And I raise this, Mr. Speaker, not with the intention of giving a prolonged accounting lesson for all members, as much as they may wish me to do that tonight, but just to set the stage for why this is relevant to today's debate. So with a separate set of capital accounts, for the first time, the government of Nova Scotia was required to depreciate the capital stock of the province, which is a charge against our operating earnings. As our capital stock has grown over time, that amount, that depreciation, has also grown over time and is a non-cash charge against the operating accounts of the province, which can be used for the replenishment of capital. Where I'm going with this is that it is the position of our party that not only should the operating statements of the province be balanced under generally accepted accounting principles, but that we should come to a full stop in the further accumulation of provincial debt, meaning that we'll generate a sufficient surplus to cover any capital spending that goes on, so the debt can come to a stop and actually start to be whittled down. There are some on the government side that say this is too high a standard to reach for, that it's too much to expect the operating statements to generate a surplus of that size, but I point out that it's not much further of a milestone beyond the balanced budget itself. Because
order, please. I would remind all honourable members in the House of Assembly that wearing partisan badges on the floor of the Assembly are not permitted. So I'd remind all honourable members to remove them before they come into the chamber. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're all wondering, without naming names, I thought that orange ties and orange scarves were kind of in. But I'm not pointing the finger at anyone. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you know.
My ex-friend.
You know, Mr. Speaker, they may or may not be wearing them in a couple of hours' time, but I will continue with my remarks. It's not that much of a milestone beyond a balanced budget to be able to actually start to pay down the outright total net direct debt of the province, because there is this charge against our earnings that is meant to be used for the replenishment of capital. That's number one, and I'll return to that theme in a moment when I talk about the estimates for the current year. The other thing that is relevant to today's debate, Mr. Speaker, is that I continue to take every opportunity to set the record straight about the state of the books when the current government took over. As recently as last week, I heard the Premier say on the radio in an interview that he had inherited a large deficit from the previous government. But that is provably, demonstrably, auditably known as lacking in truth, Mr. Speaker, because the fact of the matter is that the government inherited a balanced budget. In fact, I've tabled in this House previously the audited set of public accounts for the year ended March 31st, 2009, which ironically enough were signed not only by the Auditor General, whose job it is to audit them and sign his signature that they are prepared in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, but they were also signed by the new Minister of Finance, who came into office later in 2009. And in his message, he acknowledges that he had been in receipt of a set of public accounts that were in surplus. He says it in his own message from the minister at the start of those public accounts, and he signed it. And so I say that because it's time that we set this great inconvenient truth, this great myth, to rest. It's one thing for the government to say that they had hired a consultant who said if the following 16 things happen, they may end up with a giant deficit, which would be at least half correct. But it's completely not correct to say that they actually inherited a real deficit, because that is simply not the case, as the Minister of Finance himself affixed his signature to, as did the Auditor General. But beyond that, not only do I take every opportunity I can to point out that there had actually been 8 balanced budgets in a row and 8 balanced actual sets of public accounts, but they actually were in surplus, beyond balance, by law, thanks to Premier Ham and the Atlantic Accord that was signed in 2005, which resulted in an $830 million payment from Ottawa to Nova Scotia, and a decision by that Premier that every last cent of that $830 million would be applied against our provincial debt, as it was done, instantly. The largest single down payment against our debt in our entire provincial history. Now, accounting rules required that $830 million be amortized into the books of the province over the following 8 years, a period of time that we're still in. And so every year since, every government since, including this one, has been the beneficiary of that amortization into the books of $830 million. In some years, it's been more than $100 million. And I say this because in order to make Premier Ham's commitment true, that every cent would go to the debt, the government of the day made it the law that the province would actually run a surplus equivalent to that year's portion of the $830 million. And that is a commitment that was kept in 2005, in 2006, in 2007, in 2008, and so on. That is why we know by law that not only did we have balanced budgets, but we were running real surpluses. This exposes the other great inconvenient truth that the government likes to perpetrate, which is that March Madness caused any surplus at the end of the year to be spent before March 31st. But that's clearly not the case, because by law, the government had to run surpluses. And the Auditor General's report, which shows charts and graphs of the previous 8 years, show a string of surpluses, as was required, as was done. Now, it is a good move, in the interest of fairness, I say this, it is a good move to make sure that the lid stays on in the month of March, that the lid stays on spending, that it is kept to a minimum or snuffed out altogether, which even this bunch has not been able to accomplish. But they have made some good moves in that direction. But having said that, it is based on a false premise that all the surpluses used to get spent. That is not the case. And I can show you that. The Auditor General has shown all members that. I've tabled that very information in the House before, and the fact of the matter is this House of Assembly made it the law that we must run surpluses during that time. So I raise this, as I raise it on a number of occasions, to point out that it is not correct for anyone in the government, certainly the most senior official of the government or his Minister of Finance, to say that they inherited a large deficit. They did not. Now, I happen to believe that many Nova Scotians, knowing this great inconvenient truth that was out there, still accepted it because they